In the winter of 1636, a single flower bulb in Holland was worth more than a house on a canal in Amsterdam. People mortgaged their farms for it, sold their tools, their furniture, their savings, for a piece of greenery that hadn't even bloomed yet. Then, in February of 1637, in a single room in a small Dutch city, an auctioneer asked for bids on a basket of bulbs, and nobody raised their hand. By the end of that week, the entire market was worth almost nothing. This is the story of Tulip Mania, widely called the first recorded speculative bubble in financial history. For nearly 400 years, it's been used as the ultimate cautionary tale. The moment an entire nation supposedly lost its mind over flowers. But here's what almost nobody tells you. The version of this story you've probably heard: chimney sweeps and milkmaids gambling away their life savings, an entire society driven to ruin, might be one of the most successful pieces of financial propaganda ever written. We'll get to that. First, the story everyone knows. Tulips weren't even native to Holland. They arrived from the Ottoman Empire in the mid-1500s and almost immediately became a status symbol among the wealthy. Exotic, fragile, and nothing like the flowers Europeans had ever grown before. What made certain tulips genuinely rare wasn't even something growers could control. A virus carried by aphids caused some bulbs to break, producing wild, flame-like streaks of color instead of a single solid shade. Nobody at the time understood why it happened. They just knew the results were stunning and stunningly rare. Because nobody could reliably breed these patterns on purpose, you couldn't simply plant your way to a fortune. A bulb either broke into something extraordinary or it didn't, and there was no way to know in advance which one you were buying. That uncertainty made the rare results even more desirable. Collectors gave the most striking varieties grand, almost military names, as if they were prized racehorses or noble titles rather than flowers. The single most famous of these broken varieties was called the Semper Augustus, white petals slashed with deep red flame. By the 1630s, it was already considered one of the most valuable tulips in existence. Collectors didn't just want to own one, they wanted to be seen owning one. By 1634, demand for these rare varieties had spiraled into something closer to a financial market than a flower trade. Growers and traders began selling not just bulbs sitting in the ground, but contracts, promises to deliver a bulb at a fixed price, months in the future, once it was finally dug up. This single innovation is what actually turned tulips into a bubble. You no longer needed to own a single bulb to trade tulips. You just needed to buy a piece of paper promising a future bulb, and sell that same piece of paper to someone else before the bulb ever had to change hands. Some contracts were resold 5 times in a single winter. Buyers and sellers met not at a stock exchange, but in taverns, where deals were sealed with a round of drinks and a handshake. A system so casual it had its own nickname, trading in het ootje, loosely translated as trading on the little zero, because so much of it ran on credit rather than cash actually changing hands. And because you didn't need the cash up front, only the promise of it, ordinary tradesmen, weavers, and merchants who had never touched a tulip in their life could suddenly speculate alongside the wealthiest collectors in the country. Prices for the rarest bulbs climbed to levels that, on paper, matched the price of a house on one of Amsterdam's best canals. One particularly famous account claims a single rare bulb was traded for an entire brewery. By the winter of 1636 into 1637, the market reached its absolute peak. On a single day in early February, one auction alone is recorded to have raised 90,000 guilders, an almost unthinkable sum for the period, more than the wealthiest merchants in the country would see in years. Nobody selling and almost nobody buying seemed to be asking the obvious question: what happens if, at the end of all these contracts, somebody actually has to come up with the real money to buy a flower bulb at 20 times what it was worth a year earlier? The answer arrived on the 5th of February, 1637, at a routine bulb auction in the city of Haarlem. The auctioneer opened with a normal asking price. Nobody bid. He lowered it. Still nothing. He lowered it again, and the room stayed silent. It's worth sitting with how small that moment actually was. No government announcement, no war, no famine. Just one auctioneer in one room, failing to find a single buyer at a price that, a week earlier, would have triggered a bidding war. That's the entire trigger for one of the most famous crashes in financial history. Not a catastrophe, just a moment where the story everyone had agreed to believe quietly stopped being believable. Within days, word of that failed auction had spread to every other tulip trader in Holland, and the moment the idea took hold that prices might actually go down, the entire structure collapsed almost overnight. It wasn't really a gradual decline. It was a vanishing act. Buyers who had agreed to pay a fortune for a bulb next month suddenly couldn't be found anywhere. Sellers who were counting on that money to pay debts they'd taken on were left holding contracts that, within days, were worth almost nothing at all. Some bulbs that had changed hands for small fortunes were soon selling, if they sold at all, for 1 to 5% of their peak price. The Dutch courts were flooded with disputes over contracts nobody wanted to honor anymore. Eventually, local governments stepped in and ruled that traders could settle their tulip contracts by paying just a small fraction of the agreed price, officially acknowledging that the market had become something closer to a collective fiction than a real trade. Here's the part of this story that almost never makes it into the popular version. For nearly 2 centuries, Tulip Mania was mostly a footnote in Dutch history. The legend you've actually heard, the one with ruined chimney sweeps and a nation gambling away its future on flowers, was largely shaped by a single book written in 1841, 200 years after the events themselves, by a Scottish journalist compiling sensational tales of crowd madness. Historian Anne Goldgar spent years digging through the actual contracts, court records, and account books from the period. What she found didn't match the legend at all. She couldn't find a single verified case of someone going broke because of tulip speculation. The trade was concentrated mostly among merchants who were already comfortably wealthy, treating it more like a high-stakes hobby than their life savings. And the broader Dutch economy, one of the strongest in the world at the time, barely noticed the crash at all. That doesn't mean nothing real happened. People did sign contracts they couldn't honor. Friendships and business partnerships were genuinely strained by disputes over unpaid debts. But strained relationships among a relatively small circle of merchants is a far less dramatic headline than "A nation gambled away its future on flowers." And only one of those two versions survived 400 years in the popular imagination. In other words, the financial bubble was real. The contracts, the leverage, the irrational pricing, the panic, all genuinely happened. But the story of an entire nation brought to its knees by flower madness was largely invented later because it made a far better lesson than the messier, more boring truth. That should make you a little uneasy. Because if the most famous cautionary tale in financial history has been exaggerated for centuries to make a better story, what does that say about every other crash you've heard described as "everyone lost everything"? Sometimes the myth of universal ruin survives, not because it's accurate, but because it's the version we want repeated. It's also worth asking why this particular myth caught on so well in the first place. A story about an entire society losing its mind over flowers is simply more satisfying to repeat than a story about a relatively contained market correction among wealthy merchants. The exaggerated version teaches a cleaner moral lesson, and clean moral lessons spread faster than complicated, boring truths, which is its own quiet warning about how every financial legend we think we know might be shaped less by what actually happened and more by which version made the better story to retell. Take away the powdered wigs and the 17th century taverns, and the actual mechanism here is uncomfortably familiar. A scarce asset. A story about why it's only going to get more valuable, a way to buy in without putting up the full price today, and a crowd that keeps bidding because everyone around them is bidding too. That's not a 17th century phenomenon. That's the basic anatomy of every speculative mania since, and the bulbs are just whatever happens to be fashionable at the time. Have you ever bought into something purely because everyone around you was buying it too? Tell me in the comments. If this kind of story is your thing, subscribe. Next up, more market manias, frauds, and the very human mistakes that keep repeating themselves 400 years and counting.